Welcome back where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories. Tonight we journey into one of the most tragic and heroic tales ever told in the Dark Souls universe. The story of a knight whose very name has become synonymous with honor, courage, and ultimate sacrifice. This is the complete story of Artorias the Abysswalker, a legend whose fall from grace reveals the deepest truths about heroism, humanity, and the price of confronting forces beyond mortal comprehension. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic tale of a knight who walked into darkness so that others might live in light. Chapter 1. The Legend Born. In the golden age of Anor Londo, when the first flame burned bright and Lord Gwyn's power seemed eternal, there emerged 4 knights whose deeds would echo through the ages. Among them stood a figure who would become the greatest of them all, Knight Artorias. But to understand the magnitude of his eventual tragedy, we must first understand the heights from which he fell. Artorias was no ordinary knight. Even among the legendary 4 knights of Gwyn, he stood apart. Where Ornstein commanded through divine lightning and Kieran struck from shadows with deadly precision, where Goa's arrows could pierce dragon scales from impossible distances, Artorias possessed something different. An unwavering dedication to protecting those who could not protect themselves. His armor, crafted from the finest materials available in Anor Londo, bore the distinctive blue tint that would become his signature. The steel was blessed by the gods themselves, enchanted to provide protection, not just from physical harm, but from the spiritual corruption that plagued the darker corners of the world. Every piece was a masterwork, from his distinctive helmet, with its flowing plume, to the reinforced plates that covered his towering frame. But it was his sword that truly set Artorias apart. The great sword he wielded was unlike any weapon forged in that age, a massive blade that seemed to drink in light itself, its dark steel humming with power that few could comprehend. This was no mere weapon, but an instrument of justice, perfectly balanced and deadly in the hands of one who had dedicated his life to its mastery. The young knight's training began in the courtyards of Anor Londo, where he learned not just the techniques of combat, but the philosophy that would guide his entire existence. Under the tutelage of veteran knights and divine instructors, Artorias absorbed lessons about duty, sacrifice, and the sacred responsibility that came with wielding power in service of others. His natural talent was evident from the earliest days, where other knights might struggle for years to master basic techniques. Artorias seemed to understand instinctively how blade and body should move as one. His instructors marveled at his ability to adapt and improvise, to find solutions to tactical problems that would stump more experienced warriors. But technique alone did not make Artorias legendary. What set him apart was his heart, a boundless compassion for those who suffered, and an unshakable belief that no sacrifice was too great if it meant protecting the innocent. This moral clarity would prove to be both his greatest strength and ultimately the source of his downfall. The court of Anor Londo in those days was a place of wonder and majesty. Golden light flowed through crystal windows, illuminating halls where gods and their chosen servants planned the great works that would shape the age. It was here that Artorias first encountered Lord Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, whose very presence seemed to banish darkness from whatever space he occupied. Gwyn recognized something special in the young knight, not just skill or dedication, but a purity of purpose that reminded the Lord of Sunlight of his own younger days, when the war against the dragons had given clear meaning to every action. Under Gwyn's personal guidance, Artorias began to understand the cosmic scope of the conflicts that defined their age. The world beyond Anor Londo was not the peaceful realm that its golden halls might suggest. Darkness pressed against the borders of civilization, taking forms both subtle and terrifying. There were ancient evils that predated the Age of Fire, creatures of shadow that sought to reclaim the world for the primordial darkness that had once reigned supreme. Against these threats, ordinary soldiers were often helpless. What was needed were champions, individuals with the skill, equipment, and spiritual strength to venture into places where light itself seemed to fail. Artorias embraced this calling, with the fervor of one who had found his true purpose in life. His early missions took him to the borderlands, where civilization met the wild places of the world. Here he learned to fight not just human enemies or conventional beasts, but the twisted creatures that emerged from pools of stagnant darkness. Each victory taught him new lessons about the nature of corruption and the vigilance required to keep it at bay. The shield that would become as famous as his sword came to him during these early campaigns. Forged specifically for his use, it bore engravings that told the story of his deeds and the covenant he had made with the creatures that would become his most faithful allies, the great wolves of the ancient forest. The wolves had once been enemies of the gods, remnants of a wilder age, when nature itself seemed hostile to the order that Gwyn sought to establish. But Artorias saw in them not monsters to be destroyed, but potential allies whose strength could serve the cause of justice. Through patience, respect, and demonstrations of his own honor, he forged bonds with these magnificent creatures that would last until the end of his days. Chief among these allies was Sif, a great grey wolf, whose intelligence and loyalty matched that of any human companion. The bond between knight and wolf became legendary throughout the realm, an example of how understanding and respect could bridge the gap between different forms of life. Together, they became a force that struck fear into the hearts of those who would threaten the innocent. The partnership between Artorias and Sif represented more than just tactical cooperation. It embodied the knight's philosophy that strength should be used to protect, rather than dominate, that true power came from lifting others up, rather than tearing them down. This philosophy would guide every major decision of his career. As Artorias' reputation grew, so did the scope of the challenges he was asked to face. No longer content to patrol the borderlands, he began venturing into the deep places of the world, where ancient evils slumbered and new threats were always emerging. These expeditions required not just physical courage, but spiritual fortitude of the highest order. The great libraries of Anor Londo contained texts that spoke of primordial forces that had shaped the world in ages past. Artorias studied these works with the dedication of a scholar, understanding that knowledge of his enemies was as important as skill with his blade. He learned of the dark soul and its connection to humanity, of the abyss and its capacity to corrupt even the strongest wills. This knowledge came with warnings. The texts made clear that those who fought against such forces risked more than their lives. They risked their very souls. Prolonged exposure to certain forms of darkness could change a person fundamentally, stripping away everything that made them human. But Artorias' confidence in his own strength and purity of purpose made such warnings seem like distant concerns. The other knights of Gwyn watched their companions' growing obsession with the darkness with a mixture of admiration and concern. Ornstein, ever practical, worried that Artorias was taking unnecessary risks. Purin, with her understanding of shadow and stealth, sensed dangers that the more straightforward knight might miss. Goth, wise in the ways of war, recognized the signs of someone walking toward a fate that might be inescapable. But Artorias felt called to this path, with a certainty that brooked no doubt. If there were forces in the world that threatened the innocent, then someone had to stand against them. If that someone faced dangers that might destroy them, then so be it. The duty remained regardless of the cost. His dedication caught the attention of the gods themselves. Lord Gwyn, seeing in Artorias a champion who might be capable of confronting threats that even divine power struggled to address, began to prepare the knight for a destiny that would test every aspect of his character. The Covenant of Artorias was forged during this period, a ring of incredible power that would allow its wearer to traverse the abyss itself without being consumed by its darkness. The creation of this artifact required sacrifices from multiple gods, their combined power woven into a protective charm that represented the highest expression of divine craftsmanship. When the ring was placed upon Artorias' finger, he felt its power flow through him like liquid light. Here was protection beyond anything that armor or skill could provide, a barrier that would allow him to walk in places where others could not even survive. With this protection, he believed himself ready for any challenge the darkness might present. The ceremony, where Artorias received the covenant, was attended by the greatest figures of the age. Gods and heroes gathered to witness the anointing of their champion, the one who would carry their hopes into the deepest darkness and emerge victorious. The speeches that day spoke of inevitable triumph, of light overcoming shadow, of good prevailing over evil. Yet some who were present reported a sense of unease, a feeling that they were witnessing not just a beginning, but an ending. The power that flowed through the covenant was impressive, but darkness had a way of finding weaknesses that no protection could fully address. The very fact that such extreme measures were necessary suggested that the challenges ahead might be beyond any individual's ability to overcome. Artorias himself felt no such doubts. Standing before the assembled hosts of heaven, his sword gleaming with divine blessing, and his covenant ring pulsing with protective power, he felt ready to face whatever the darkness might throw at him. His faith in his own abilities, in the righteousness of his cause, and in the power of the gods who stood behind him, seemed absolute. The great wolf Sif stood beside him during the ceremony, a living symbol of the bonds that could exist between different forms of life, when respect and understanding replaced fear and suspicion. The sight of knight and wolf standing together before the throne of the gods became one of the most enduring images of that golden age, a reminder of what could be achieved when courage and compassion worked hand in hand. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled dignitaries began to disperse, Artorias felt the weight of expectations settling upon his shoulders. He had been given tools that few mortals had ever possessed, blessed by powers that commanded the respect of dragons and demons alike. Now it was time to prove himself worthy of these gifts. The first major test of his enhanced abilities came sooner than anyone expected. Reports reached Anor Londo of a corruption spreading through New Londo, a darkness that seemed to be converting loyal knights into something monstrous. Here was exactly the kind of threat that Artorias had been prepared to face, an evil that required someone capable of walking in darkness without being consumed by it. The mission to New Londo would establish Artorias' reputation as the Abysswalker, the knight who could venture into places where even light itself seemed to fail. But it would also provide the first hint of the challenges that lay ahead. Enemies who could not be defeated through strength alone, corruption that worked on levels deeper than physical combat could address. Chapter 2: The New Londo Campaign. The city of New Londo had once been a beacon of hope in a world where the undead curse spread fear and despair. Unlike other kingdoms that viewed the cursed as monsters to be driven out or destroyed, New Londo welcomed them as citizens deserving of protection and respect. This progressive policy had made it a haven for those who had lost their humanity to the dark sign, a place where they could find acceptance and purpose. But something had gone terribly wrong. The reports that reached Anor Londo spoke of knights who had served faithfully for years suddenly turning against their former comrades, of civilians disappearing in the night, of a darkness that seemed to spread through the city's very foundations. Most disturbing of all were accounts of the four kings themselves, the city's beloved rulers, exhibiting behavior that suggested they had fallen under some malevolent influence. When Lord Gwyn announced that Artorias would be dispatched to investigate and resolve the situation, the knight accepted the assignment with his characteristic determination. Here was an opportunity to prove that the powers he had been granted could make a real difference in the world, that the faith placed in him by gods and mortals alike was justified. The journey to New Londo took Artorias through landscapes that grew progressively more ominous as he approached his destination. The very air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made both man and beast uncomfortable. Sif, normally eager for adventure, showed signs of unease that the great wolf had never displayed before, but Artorias pressed forward, confident that whatever corruption he might face could be cleansed by righteous action. New Londo's walls still stood proud and strong when Artorias first laid eyes upon them, but even from a distance, something felt wrong. The banners that should have flown from the towers hung limp and colorless, as if the very wind had lost its will to stir them. The gates that should have been bustling with activity stood strangely empty, manned by guards whose posture suggested weariness rather than welcome. When Artorias announced himself at the gates, the response he received was unlike anything he had experienced in his career. The guards, who should have been honored to welcome one of the legendary Knights of Gwyn, instead seemed suspicious and hostile. They questioned his motives, demanded to know who had sent him, and suggested that his presence was neither needed nor wanted. This reception provided the knight's first real clue about the nature of the corruption he faced. Whatever had infected New Lundo was not simply a matter of external enemies or conventional political intrigue. The very people who should have been most grateful for assistance seemed to view it as a threat. Something was working to turn the city's inhabitants against the very concept of outside help. Once inside the walls, Artorias found a city transformed. The streets that should have been filled with the bustle of daily life instead echoed with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. Windows that should have glowed with welcoming light remained dark and shuttered. The few citizens he encountered moved with the furtive manner of people who feared being observed. The undead residents, who had once found refuge and purpose in New Lundo, now seemed to have retreated into themselves. Their behavior suggested not the peaceful acceptance of their condition that the city had been famous for, but a deeper kind of despair, as if something had drained away not just their humanity, but their hope for any kind of meaningful existence. Artorias's investigation led him through districts that became progressively more disturbing. In the merchant quarter, shops stood empty and abandoned, their wares scattered as if the owners had fled in panic. In the residential areas, homes showed signs of hasty evacuation, with personal belongings left behind in ways that suggested their owners had left suddenly and with no intention of returning. But it was in the administrative district that Artorias encountered the first direct evidence of what had befallen the city. Here he found knights who had once served the four kings with honor and distinction, but who now wore armor that had been changed in subtle but disturbing ways. The bright steel had taken on a darker hue, and the knights themselves moved with a predatory grace that suggested they saw other humans not as people to protect, but as prey to be hunted. These dark wraiths, as they had come to be known, represented everything that Artorias had dedicated his life to, preventing. They were warriors who had allowed darkness to corrupt their purpose, turning their strength against the very people they had sworn to protect. When diplomacy failed to reach whatever remained of their original selves, Artorias was forced to do battle with former champions, whose fall from grace mirrored his own greatest fears. The combat with the Dark Wraiths provided Artorias with his first practical experience of fighting enemies who wielded the power of the Abyss. Their weapons seemed to drink light from the air around them, creating zones of supernatural darkness that disoriented and confused. Their techniques, while recognizably based on traditional knightly training, had been modified in ways that prioritized efficiency over honor, effectiveness over elegance. Most disturbing of all was their apparent ability to drain the life force from their opponents. Artorias discovered that wounds inflicted by Dark Wraith weapons did not heal normally, and that prolonged exposure to their presence left him feeling weakened in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Here was corruption that attacked not just the body, but the very essence of what made a person human. Yet Artorias's blessed equipment and divine protection proved effective against these new enemies. His covenant ring created a barrier of light that prevented their life-draining abilities from affecting him directly, while his sword's holy enchantments allowed him to cut through their dark defenses. For the first time since arriving in New Lundo, the knight felt that he was making real progress against the corruption that had infected the city. As he pressed deeper into the urban maze, Artorias began to piece together the sequence of events that had led to New Lundo's fall. The corruption had not struck suddenly, but had spread gradually through the city's population over a period of months or even years. It had begun with subtle changes in behavior and policy, modifications that seemed reasonable at the time, but that had prepared the ground for more dramatic transformations. The four kings, according to witnesses who still retained enough of their original personalities to communicate, had fallen under the influence of a mysterious teacher who had promised them knowledge of humanity's true nature. This figure, whose identity remained unclear, had introduced techniques and philosophies that gradually eroded the moral foundations that had once guided the city's leadership. The process had been so gradual that few had recognized it as corruption until it was too late to reverse. By the time the Dark Wraiths had openly revealed themselves and begun their campaign of systematic predation, the city's defenses had already been compromised from within. Those who might have organized resistance had either been converted to the cause or eliminated as threats to the new order. Artorias' investigation of the Four Kings' Palace revealed the full scope of what he faced. The halls that had once echoed with the sounds of just governance now hummed with a different kind of energy, dark, predatory, and utterly alien to human values. The kings themselves, when he finally encountered them, had been transformed into something that retained their intelligence and power, but had lost all connection to the compassion that had once made them beloved leaders. The confrontation with the Four Kings was unlike any battle Artorias had previously fought. These were not enemies to be defeated through superior skill or courage, but corrupted souls, whose very existence represented a philosophical challenge to everything the knight believed about the nature of good and evil. They had not been conquered by darkness, but had chosen to embrace it, believing that they were serving humanity's best interests by doing so. The battle itself was a test of more than just combat prowess. The Four Kings wielded weapons that seemed to cut through more than just physical armor, striking at the spiritual defenses that protected Artorias' essential self. Each blow carried with it visions of what he could become if he abandoned his commitment to the light. Power beyond imagination, freedom from the burdens of conscience, and the ability to reshape the world according to his own will. But Artorias' training and divine protection held firm. His covenant ring flared with protective light whenever the king's attacks threatened to breach his spiritual defenses, while his blessed sword cut through their dark forms with devastating effect. One by one, the corrupted rulers fell before his righteous assault, their final moments marked not by expressions of hatred or regret, but by what almost seemed like relief, as if some part of them had been waiting for someone to end their torment. The defeat of the Four Kings marked the beginning of the end for New Lundo's corruption. But Artorias' work was far from finished. The city still harbored countless dark wraiths who would continue their predations unless systematically hunted down and eliminated. More importantly, the source of the corruption, whatever force had originally seduced the Four Kings into embracing darkness, remained unidentified and presumably still active. The methodical process of cleansing New Lundo taught Artorias valuable lessons about the nature of the enemies he faced. The corruption was not simply a matter of external invasion, but something that worked by exploiting existing weaknesses in human nature. It offered power and knowledge to those who felt frustrated by conventional limitations, promising solutions to real problems, while concealing the true cost of its gifts. The dark wraiths he hunted through the city's twisting corridors were not mindless monsters, but individuals who had made conscious choices to trade their humanity for power. Many could still speak, still reason, still remember what they had once been. This made them more dangerous than mere beasts, but also more tragic. Each one represented not just a threat to be eliminated, but a person who had been lost to forces they had not fully understood. As his campaign progressed, Artorias began to notice subtle changes in his own responses to the corruption around him. Where once he had felt only revulsion and determination to cleanse the darkness, he now found himself beginning to understand the appeal of what the dark wraiths offered. The power they wielded was real, their freedom from conventional moral constraints was genuine, and their promises of liberation from divine authority were not entirely without merit. These thoughts troubled the knight more than any physical challenge he had faced. He had expected to fight external enemies, not to battle doubts and temptations that arose from within his own mind. The covenant ring that protected him from direct corruption could not shield him from the more subtle influence of prolonged exposure to darkness, the gradual erosion of certainty that came from seeing the world through the eyes of his enemies. Sith, ever sensitive to his master's emotional state, began to show signs of concern that had nothing to do with their immediate physical safety. The great wolf could sense changes in Artorias that the knight himself was not yet ready to acknowledge, a hardening of his resolve that was beginning to edge toward ruthlessness, a willingness to use more violent methods when diplomacy failed to produce immediate results. The final phase of the New Lundo campaign required Artorias to venture into the deepest levels of the city, where the concentration of abyssal energy was so intense that even his protected status could not entirely shield him from its effects. Here, in chambers that had been carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight, he found evidence of the true scope of the corruption he faced. The chambers contained libraries of forbidden knowledge, texts that described techniques for manipulating human nature and exploiting the dark heritage that lay dormant within every mortal soul. These were not the ravings of madmen or the propaganda of simple evil, but sophisticated analyses of cosmic forces that offered genuine insights into the nature of existence itself. Reading these texts, Artorias began to understand that the corruption of New Lundo was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that extended across the known world. The forces he had defeated here were connected to something much greater, a cosmic conflict between different visions of what humanity's future should be. The four kings had not simply fallen to random corruption, but had been recruited as agents in a war whose scope dwarfed anything he had previously imagined. This revelation transformed Artorias' understanding of his own mission. He had come to New Lundo, expecting to solve a local problem through the direct application of force and righteousness. Instead, he had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of the world order he served. The victory he had achieved here was real and important, but it was also clearly just the beginning of a much larger struggle. The knowledge he gained in those deep chambers would prove both blessing and curse. It gave him insights into the nature of his enemies that would serve him well in future conflicts, but it also planted seeds of doubt about the righteousness of his own cause. If the forces of darkness could offer such compelling arguments for their position, if they could attract followers who were genuinely motivated by concern for humanity's welfare, then perhaps the conflict between light and dark was not as clear-cut as he had been taught to believe. When Artorias finally emerged from the depths of New Lundo, he brought with him both victory and questions that would plague him for the rest of his career. The city had been cleansed, its population freed from the corruption that had enslaved them, and the immediate threat of dark wraith expansion had been eliminated. But the knight who returned to Anor Londo was not quite the same as the one who had departed. The changes were subtle at first, a tendency toward longer silences, a more critical attitude toward the orders he received, a growing interest in the deeper implications of the conflicts he was asked to resolve. His fellow knights noticed these shifts, but attributed them to the natural growth that came from facing serious challenges. None of them suspected that Artorias had encountered something in New Lundo that had shaken his faith in the very foundations of his worldview. The reports he submitted to Lord Gwyn emphasized the tactical aspects of his success, while downplaying the philosophical questions that had been raised by his discoveries. Artorias was not yet ready to voice his doubts about the cosmic order he served, but neither could he simply ignore what he had learned. Instead, he chose to bury his concerns and focus on the next mission, hoping that continued service would either resolve his doubts or provide clearer answers to the questions that now haunted his quiet moments. Lord Gwyn, recognizing the success of the New Lundo campaign, began to envision even greater challenges for his champion. If Artorias could cleanse an entire city of abyssal corruption, then perhaps he could be trusted with missions that other heroes might find impossible. The Covenant Ring had proven its worth. The knight's skill and dedication remained unquestionable, and the threats facing the Age of Fire seemed to require champions who could venture into places where ordinary warriors could not survive. The stage was being set for the greatest test of Artorias' career, a mission that would take him to the very heart of darkness itself, where the corruption he had fought in New Lundo had its ultimate source. In the distant kingdom of Oolacile, ancient forces were stirring that would challenge everything he believed about heroism, sacrifice, and the price of protecting those who could not protect themselves. But before that final trial would come, Artorias would have time to reflect on what he had learned in New Lundo, to train with new techniques that might better prepare him for abyssal corruption, and to strengthen the bonds with those who would support him in the trials ahead. The knight had proven himself capable of walking in darkness and emerging victorious, but his greatest test still lay ahead. A test that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of all who looked to him for protection. Chapter 3: The Covenant and the Wolf. In the aftermath of the New Lundo campaign, Artorias found himself changed in ways that went far deeper than mere experience. The knight who returned to Anno Lundo carried with him not just the satisfaction of victory, but questions that gnawed at his certainty like a slow poison. The corruption he had witnessed was not the simple evil he had expected, but something far more complex, a darkness that offered genuine alternatives to the divine order he served. It was during this period of reflection and doubt that the most important relationship of Artorias' life deepened into something that would define both his greatest triumphs and his ultimate tragedy. Sif, the great grey wolf, who had been his companion since the early days of his knighthood, began to take on a role that went far beyond mere battlefield ally. In the wolf's unwavering loyalty and pure heart, Artorias found an anchor that helped him maintain his moral center, even as the foundations of his worldview shifted beneath him. The bond between knight and wolf had always been extraordinary, but the trials of New Lundo had revealed new depths to their partnership. Where other warriors might have relied on human counselors or divine guidance, Artorias increasingly turned to Sif for the kind of emotional support that could not be found in strategic discussions or theological debates. The wolf's presence provided a reminder of values that transcended the complex political and philosophical considerations that now plagued the knight's thinking. Sif possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that often surpassed that of actual humans. The great wolf could sense the emotional undercurrents that Artorias tried to hide from his fellow knights, could recognize the moments when doubt and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm his master's legendary resolve. In response, Sif would offer the kind of wordless comfort that only the deepest friendship could provide, a reminder that some bonds transcended the complications of cosmic politics. The time they spent together in the forest surrounding Anno Lundo became a refuge for Artorias, a place where he could temporarily set aside the burden of being a legendary hero and simply exist as himself. Here, among the ancient trees where Sif felt most at home, knight and wolf would hunt together, not for any strategic purpose, but for the simple joy of partnership and shared adventure. These expeditions revealed aspects of both knight and wolf that the formal atmosphere of Anno Lundo rarely allowed to emerge. Artorias discovered that Sif possessed not just intelligence and loyalty, but a sense of humor and playfulness that provided welcome relief from the weight of his responsibilities. The wolf would engage in elaborate games of chase and mock combat, treating these peaceful moments as opportunities to explore the pure joy of movement and companionship. For his part, Artorias found that the presence of his lupine companion allowed him to access parts of his own nature that his knightly training had taught him to suppress. The rigid discipline that made him an effective warrior could sometimes isolate him from the more spontaneous and emotional aspects of human experience. With Sif, he could laugh freely, express frustration without worrying about maintaining dignity, and simply enjoy the moment without constantly analyzing its implications for his duty. The deeper their bond grew, the more Artorias began to understand that Sif represented something crucial that he had been missing from his understanding of heroism. The wolf's loyalty was not based on abstract principles or cosmic philosophies, but on simple, direct love, the kind of unconditional commitment that asked nothing in return and offered everything without reservation. This purity of emotion stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly complex motivations that Artorias encountered in his interactions with gods and men. As reports began to filter back to Anno Lundo of new disturbances in distant kingdoms, Artorias found himself dreading the moment when duty would call him away from the peace he had found in Sif's company. The wolf had become more than a companion. Sif had become the living embodiment of everything worth protecting. a reminder of the innocent trust that heroes were supposed to safeguard. The relationship between Artorias and Sif also served as a powerful symbol within the broader culture of Anor Londo. Their partnership demonstrated that the bonds of loyalty and affection could transcend the boundaries between different forms of life, that understanding and respect could create connections stronger than any formal alliance. Young knights often requested to observe their training sessions, hoping to learn not just tactical techniques, but the deeper secrets of cooperation that made their partnership so effective. Yet the very depth of their bond created new vulnerabilities for both knight and wolf. Artorias' growing emotional dependence on Sif's presence meant that any threat to the wolf became a threat to his own psychological stability. Sif's fierce devotion to the knight created a willingness to follow Artorias into any danger, regardless of the personal cost. What had begun as a source of strength was becoming a potential weakness that enemies might exploit. The covenant of Artorias, the ring that protected him from abyssal corruption, began to take on new significance in light of his deepening relationship with Sif. Originally conceived as a tool for allowing the knight to venture into dangerous territory alone, the covenant now represented something different, a means of protecting not just himself, but the companion whose welfare had become inseparable from his own sense of purpose. The ring's power was not unlimited, and Artorias began to study its mechanisms with new intensity. If he could understand exactly how it provided protection against corruption, perhaps he could find ways to extend that protection to Sif as well. The thought of facing abyssal forces without his companion was becoming unbearable, but the idea of exposing the wolf to corruption that might destroy his pure heart was equally unacceptable. This research led Artorias into areas of study that he had previously left to scholars and mages. He spent long hours in the libraries of Anor Londo, poring over texts that described the theoretical foundations of divine magic and the principles that governed protective enchantments. What he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The Covenant's power could potentially be shared, but doing so would require modifications that might weaken its overall effectiveness. The philosophical implications of this dilemma began to consume an increasing amount of Artorias' mental energy. Was it justifiable to reduce his own protection in order to safeguard a companion, even one as beloved as Sif? How could he balance his responsibility to complete the missions entrusted to him against his desire to protect someone who had never asked to be drawn into cosmic conflicts? These questions had no easy answers, but they could not be ignored. Sif, with the intuitive wisdom that characterized the Great Wolf's approach to complex problems, seemed to understand the nature of Artorias' dilemma without needing explicit explanation. During their quiet moments together, the wolf would position himself in ways that seemed designed to remind the knight that their partnership was based on choice rather than obligation. Sif had chosen to follow Artorias into danger because of love and loyalty, not because of any external compulsion. This understanding did little to ease Artorias' concerns, but it did help him recognize that his attempts to make choices for Sif were fundamentally disrespectful of the wolf's autonomy and intelligence. Just as Artorias valued his own right to choose his path despite the risks involved, Sif deserved the same respect for his own decisions about where his loyalty should lead him. The resolution of this internal conflict came through a series of training exercises designed to test the practical applications of shared protection. Working with the most skilled enchanters in Anor Londo, Artorias developed techniques that would allow him to extend the Covenant's protection to Sif during critical moments. The process required a level of coordination and trust that pushed both knight and wolf to new levels of cooperation. These training sessions revealed capabilities that neither Artorias nor Sif had fully realized they possessed. The knight discovered that his bond with the wolf allowed him to sense danger and opportunity through channels that had nothing to do with conventional perception. Sif found that his natural instincts could be enhanced and focused through conscious cooperation with Artorias' tactical planning. The techniques they developed together created a form of combat partnership that was unique in the annals of knightly warfare, where traditional cavalry relied on the horse as a mount and weapon platform. Artorias and Sif fought as equals, each bringing their own strengths to bear in coordinated attacks that were greater than the sum of their parts. The knight's reach and armor complemented the wolf's speed and agility, while Sif's natural hunting instincts provided tactical insights that Artorias' formal training had not covered. More importantly, their partnership began to attract the attention of other wolves from the ancient forests. These creatures, drawn by their recognition of the bond between Artorias and Sif, began to appear on the borders of Anor Londo's territory. They did not seek to join the knight's service directly, but their presence created an informal network of allies that extended his ability to gather information and respond to threats across a much wider geographical area. This development had profound implications for Artorias' understanding of his role in the broader cosmic order. He was no longer simply a knight serving divine authority, but had become a bridge between different forms of consciousness and life. The wolves accepted him not because of his divine mandate, but because of the genuine respect and love he showed for one of their own. The covenant that emerged from this relationship was unlike anything in the formal hierarchies of Anor Londo. It was based on mutual recognition and voluntary cooperation, rather than oaths of service or divine command. The wolves offered their assistance freely, and Artorias accepted it with the understanding that their alliance was built on friendship rather than obligation. This informal covenant began to influence Artorias' approach to all his relationships. He started to question whether the formal structures of knightly service, with their emphasis on duty and obedience, might be inferior to connections based on genuine affection and shared values. The purity of his bond with Sif and the other wolves highlighted the political complications that characterized his interactions with gods and fellow knights. Yet, this growing network of lupine allies also created new responsibilities and concerns. Artorias found himself thinking not just about the success of his own missions, but about the welfare of creatures who had placed their trust in him. The Vovals were powerful and intelligent, but they lacked his divine protection and enchanted equipment. Any conflict that drew them into battle against abyssal forces would expose them to corruption and destruction that his covenant ring could not prevent. The weight of these concerns began to affect Artorias' performance in ways that his superiors found troubling. Where once he had approached missions with focused determination, he now spent considerable time analyzing the potential risks to his lupine allies. His planning became more cautious, his execution more conservative, as he sought to minimize exposure for those who lacked his supernatural protection. Lord Gwyn, observing these changes in his champion's behavior, began to worry that Artorias' effectiveness was being compromised by emotional attachments that had grown beyond reasonable bounds. The Lord of Sunlight respected the bond between knight and wolf, but he could not allow personal relationships to interfere with the cosmic responsibilities that Artorias had accepted when he received the Covenant Ring. The tension between Artorias' growing emotional investments and his formal duties came to a head when reports arrived of a new crisis that would require his immediate attention. In the distant kingdom of Oolacile, scholars had apparently awakened something ancient and terrible, and the resulting corruption was spreading at an alarming rate. This was exactly the kind of threat that Artorias had been prepared to face, but it was also the kind of mission that would require him to venture into the deepest darkness with no guarantee of return. The prospect of leaving Sif and the other wolves behind, while he traveled to face unknown dangers, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet the alternative, bringing them into contact with the kind of corruption that had created the dark wraiths of New Londo, seemed even worse. For the first time in his career, Artorias found himself wishing that he had never accepted the power and responsibility that made him uniquely qualified to face such threats. Sif, sensing his master's internal struggle, began to communicate in the wordless way that had developed between them over years of partnership. The Great Wolf's message was clear and unwavering. They would face whatever came together, as they always had. The risks were understood and accepted. The bond between them was stronger than any fear of corruption or death. This declaration of loyalty, rather than resolving Artorias' dilemma, only intensified his anguish. The very depth of Sif's devotion made the prospect of exposing the wolf to abyssal corruption seem like a betrayal of everything their relationship represented. How could he protect someone by leading them into the exact danger that protection was meant to prevent? The solution, when it finally came to him, was both elegant and terrible in its implications. Artorias would indeed travel to Oolacile with Sif at his side, but he would also carry with him his great shield, a barrier that could provide temporary protection for the wolf if the corruption proved too powerful for the shared covenant to handle. The shield was large enough to create a sanctuary of light in even the deepest darkness, a refuge where Sif could wait in safety while Artorias faced the worst dangers alone. This plan satisfied neither his desire to keep Sif completely safe, nor his need for the wolf's companionship and assistance during the mission. It was a compromise that acknowledged both the practical realities of the threat they faced and the emotional realities of their relationship. Neither knight nor wolf was entirely happy with the arrangement, but both recognized it as the best solution available under impossible circumstances. The preparations for the Oolacile mission took on a solemn quality that reflected Artorias' growing awareness that this might be his most dangerous assignment yet. The reports from that distant kingdom spoke of corruption that surpassed anything he had encountered in New Lundo, of an awakening that had torn holes in reality itself. Even with all his divine protection and hard-won experience, there was no guarantee that he would prove equal to whatever waited in Oolacile's depths. The other knights of Gwyn offered their assistance, recognizing the scope of the threat and the danger their comrade would face. But Artorias declined their offers, understanding that the corruption he was meant to confront could only be safely approached by someone with his specific protections. To bring others along would be to expose them to forces that could destroy them instantly, while their presence might actually complicate his ability to use his covenant's power effectively. This decision to face the ultimate test alone, or nearly alone, with only Sif for company, reflected how much Artorias had changed since his early days as a knight. Where once he had valued the camaraderie and support of his fellow warriors, he now understood that some battles could only be fought by those who possessed the specific tools and knowledge necessary to survive them. His isolation was not a choice, but a consequence of the unique role he had accepted. The farewell ceremonies held before his departure to Oolacile carried an air of finality that troubled many who witnessed them. Artorias had always been confident in his ability to overcome whatever challenges he faced, but now there was a gravity in his manner that suggested he understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. He spoke to his fellow knights, not as someone who expected to return victorious, but as someone who wanted to ensure that important things were said while there was still time to say them. To Sif, he offered promises that were both reassurance and apology. He would do everything in his power to keep the wolf safe, but he could not guarantee that their mission would end as their previous adventures had. The great wolf accepted these words with the dignity that characterized all their interactions, offering in return a loyalty that needed no words to express its depth and permanence. The journey to Oolacile would test every aspect of the bond that Artorias and Sif had built together. It would challenge not just their combat skills and tactical cooperation, but their emotional resilience and spiritual strength. The corruption they would face was designed to exploit exactly the kind of deep emotional connections that made their partnership so powerful, turning love into weakness and loyalty into a path to destruction. Yet as they set out from Anor Londo on what would prove to be their final adventure together, both knight and wolf carried with them something that no corruption could entirely destroy. Their bond had been forged through years of shared experience, tested through countless dangers, and strengthened by the kind of mutual understanding that transcended the boundaries between different forms of consciousness. Whatever happened in the depths of Oolacile, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. Chapter 4. The Call to Oolacile. The message that summoned Artorias to his ultimate trial arrived in Anor Londo on a grey morning, when the eternal flame seemed to burn with less warmth than usual. The courier, who brought the urgent dispatch, bore the travel-stained appearance of one who had ridden hard through dangerous territory, his horse foam-flecked and trembling from exhaustion. Even before the sealed parchment was opened, those present could sense that it contained news of dire import. Lord Gwyn himself broke the seal and read the contents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he absorbed the details of what had transpired in the distant kingdom of Oolacile. When he finished, he set the letter aside and fixed Artorias with a look that conveyed both the magnitude of the crisis and the terrible certainty that only one knight in all the realms possessed the ability to address it. The scholars of Oolacile, in their insatiable quest for knowledge, had delved too deeply into mysteries that were better left undisturbed. Their excavations beneath the royal archives had uncovered something ancient, a tomb that bore markers indicating it contained one of the primeval humans who had lived in the age before the current cosmic order was established. Driven by curiosity and convinced of their own scholarly wisdom, they had broken the seals that kept this tomb inviolate and awakened what lay within. What emerged from that disturbed grave was beyond their ability to comprehend or control. The being they had awakened was not merely an ancient human, but something whose very existence was connected to the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. Its rage at being torn from peaceful slumber had manifested as a form of corruption so powerful that it threatened to tear holes in the fabric of existence itself. The corruption spreading from Oolacile was unlike anything that had been encountered before, where the darkness of New Lundo had worked through seduction and gradual conversion. This new threat operated through direct assault on the nature of reality. Witnesses described pools of absolute darkness that seemed to exist outside normal space, creatures spawned from concentrated shadow that defied conventional understanding of life and death. Most disturbing of all were the reports of Princess Dusk, the kingdom's most accomplished sorceress, who had vanished into the expanding zone of corruption. If someone of her power and knowledge could be lost to whatever force had been unleashed, then the threat clearly exceeded anything that conventional military or magical responses could address. This was a crisis that required someone capable of walking in the deepest darkness and emerging unscathed. Artorias accepted the mission with the grim determination that had come to characterize his approach to the most dangerous assignments. He understood that Oolacile represented not just another challenge to overcome, but potentially the culmination of everything he had trained for throughout his career. The covenant ring on his finger pulsed with protective energy, as if responding to his resolve, reminding him that he possessed tools that no other warrior could claim. The preparation for the Oolacile mission was more extensive than any Artorias had previously undertaken. The reports made it clear that he would be facing corruption on a scale that dwarfed even the New Lundo crisis, and that the source of this corruption was not merely powerful, but fundamentally alien to the normal order of existence. Every aspect of his equipment and abilities needed to be optimized for what might prove to be the ultimate test of his powers. His great sword was subjected to additional blessings from the highest-ranking clerics in Anor Londo, its already formidable edge enhanced with enchantments specifically designed to cut through abyssal darkness. His armor was reinforced with protective wards that had been developed based on the lessons learned from his previous encounters with corruption. Most importantly, his covenant ring was examined and fine-tuned to ensure that its protective barriers would hold against forms of darkness that might be more concentrated than any previously encountered. The selection of equipment for Sif required equally careful consideration. The Great Wolf's natural armor of fur and hide provided some protection against conventional threats, but abyssal corruption could bypass physical defenses entirely. Artorias worked with the finest craftsmen in Anor Londo to create a collar and braces that would extend some measure of protection to his companion, understanding that Sif's welfare was as important to the mission's success as his own survival. The strategic planning for the Oolacile mission revealed the limitations of conventional military thinking when applied to supernatural threats. Traditional approaches that relied on maps, supply lines, and reinforcement schedules were largely irrelevant when dealing with corruption that could warp space itself and spawn enemies from the very shadows. Instead, Artorias found himself planning for scenarios that seemed more like philosophical thought experiments than tactical situations. The journey to Oolacile took Knight and Wolf through regions that showed increasingly obvious signs of the corruption's influence. Villages that should have been bustling with activity stood empty and silent, their inhabitants either fled or transformed into something that no longer qualified as human. The very landscape seemed affected, with plants growing in unnatural configurations and water sources taking on properties that made them unsafe for normal consumption. These warning signs served to prepare Artorias psychologically for what he would face in Oolacile itself, but they also provided valuable intelligence about the nature of the corruption he was meant to confront. Unlike the politically motivated darkness of New Lundo, this new threat seemed to operate on more fundamental levels, affecting the basic structures of reality rather than simply exploiting human weaknesses. As they drew closer to their destination, Sif began to exhibit behaviors that reflected the great wolf's sensitivity to supernatural influences. The normally confident and eager companion became increasingly cautious, frequently stopping to test the air with senses that could detect threats invisible to human perception. These signs of unease from such a reliable source served to confirm Artorias' own growing sense that they were approaching something unprecedented in its danger. The first glimpse of Oolacile from a distant hilltop revealed a kingdom transformed by forces beyond normal comprehension. The once proud towers that had housed the realm's greatest scholars now twisted through impossible angles, their architecture defying the laws that should have governed physical structure. A pall of darkness hung over the entire region, not the normal shadow of clouds or night, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. Even from this safe distance, Artorias could feel the power of his covenant ring, responding to the corruption that emanated from Oolacile. The protective enchantments that normally remained dormant unless directly threatened now hummed with constant activity, creating a barrier of light around both knight and wolf that served as their only protection against influences that permeated the very air. The approach to Oolacile's borders required careful navigation through territory that had been fundamentally altered by the spreading corruption. Paths that should have led directly to the kingdom's gates instead twisted through landscapes that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Time itself seemed affected, with moments stretching into hours and hours compressed into heartbeats, depending on their proximity to the sources of abyssal power. These spatial distortions served as both obstacle and warning system, alerting Artorias to concentrations of corruption that might otherwise have caught him unprepared. The Covenant Ring's protective field created a zone of stable reality around him and Sif, allowing them to navigate through areas where unprotected travelers would have been lost or transformed beyond recognition. The first inhabitants of corrupted Oolacile that they encountered were barely recognizable as once having been human. The transformation that had overtaken them went far beyond the selective enhancement that had created the dark wraiths of New Lundo. These creatures seemed to have been rebuilt from the ground up according to principles that had nothing to do with normal biology or consciousness. Yet traces of their original humanity remained, creating a tragic dimension to their condition that made combat with them a form of mercy killing, rather than simple elimination of threats. Artorias found himself fighting enemies who retained enough of their former selves to recognize what they had lost, whose attacks carried desperation, born of awareness that they were no longer the people they had once been. The progression deeper into Oolacile revealed the full scope of what the scholar's curiosity had unleashed. The corruption had not simply infected the kingdom's population, but had rewritten the fundamental rules that governed existence within its borders. Architecture flowed like liquid, while retaining the structural integrity of solid stone. Gravity operated according to local whims, rather than universal law. Most disturbing of all, the boundary between life and death had become negotiable, creating beings that existed in states that defied conventional classification. Through all these horrors, Artorias pressed forward with the determination that had made him legendary. His great sword cut through transformed enemies with devastating efficiency, while his covenant ring protected him and Sif from the reality-warping effects that would have destroyed lesser beings instantly. But with each step deeper into the corrupted kingdom, the knight could feel the strain of maintaining his protection against forces that seemed to grow stronger the closer he came to their source. The search for Princess Dusk led Artorias through the ruins of Oolacile's great library, where the kingdom's scholars had pursued the research that had led to their doom. Here, among scattered texts and corrupted artifacts, he found evidence of the progression that had led from innocent scholarly inquiry to cosmic catastrophe. The researchers had believed they were studying ancient history, never suspecting that they were awakening forces that predated history itself. The trail of clues left by the princess's passage through the corrupted library revealed both her courage and her growing desperation. She had clearly attempted to find some way to reverse or contain the corruption, using her considerable magical abilities to create barriers and safe zones within the spreading darkness. But her efforts had been ultimately futile against forces that operated on scales far beyond individual human power. Following her path deeper into the heart of Oolacile's corruption, Artorias began to understand that this mission would be unlike any he had previously undertaken. The enemy he faced was not simply another manifestation of darkness to be defeated through superior skill and righteous determination. This was something that challenged the very foundations of existence itself, something that might prove beyond any individual's ability to overcome. Yet retreat was not an option. Too much was at stake. Too many innocent lives hung in the balance, and too many had already been lost to allow the corruption to spread beyond Oolacile's borders. Whatever lay ahead in the deepest chambers of the corrupted kingdom, whatever price would be demanded for victory or even survival, Artorias was committed to paying it. The alternative, allowing this new form of darkness to escape and consume the wider world, was simply unthinkable. With Sif at his side and his covenant ring blazing with protective light, the greatest knight of the age prepared to descend into the abyss itself and face whatever ancient power the scholars of Oolacile had so foolishly awakened. Behind them lay the world of light and order that they had sworn to protect. Ahead lay darkness beyond imagining, and the ultimate test of everything they had trained for throughout their legendary partnership. Chapter 5. The Descent into Darkness. The entrance to the deepest levels of Oolacile lay behind barriers that seemed to exist in defiance of natural law. Where normal architecture would have featured stairs or corridors leading downward, the corrupted palace instead offered what could only be described as wounds in reality itself. Tears in the fabric of existence through which could be glimpsed. Realms that operated according to different principles entirely. Standing before these impossible passages, Artorias felt his covenant ring pulse with protective energy more intense than any he had previously experienced. The ancient enchantments woven into the artifact recognized the nature of what lay beyond and were marshalling every defensive measure at their disposal. Even with this divine protection, the knight could sense that he was about to cross a threshold from which there might be no return. Sif pressed close against his master's side, the great wolf's natural courage warring with instincts that screamed warnings about the dangers ahead. The lupine senses that could detect threats invisible to human perception were overwhelmed by emanations of wrongness that seemed to seep from the very walls around them. Yet the wolf's loyalty remained unshaken. Wherever Artorias chose to go, Sif would follow. The first step into the corrupted depths was like plunging into water that burned instead of cooling. The Covenant Ring's protective field flared around both knight and wolf, creating a bubble of stable reality that allowed them to function within spaces that should have been uninhabitable. Through the barrier's protective glow, they could see corridors that twisted through impossible geometries, lit by sources that cast shadows in directions that had no name. The deeper they descended, the more obvious it became that the corruption of Oolacile was unlike anything Artorias had previously encountered. Where the darkness of New Lundo had worked by exploiting human nature, this new threat seemed to be rewriting the fundamental laws that governed existence itself. Gravity flowed in currents rather than pulling uniformly downward. Time moved in eddies and streams that could trap the unwary in moments that lasted eternities or compress hours into heartbeats. Navigation through this transformed landscape required constant vigilance and adaptation. Paths that seemed solid could prove to be illusions that led into pits of absolute darkness, while barriers that appeared impassable might dissolve at a touch. Artorias found himself relying increasingly on Sif's animal instincts, trusting the wolf's ability to sense safe passage through areas where human senses provided contradictory or impossible information. The creatures that inhabited these deep places defied classification according to any system of knowledge that Artorias possessed. They moved through the warped passages with fluid grace, their forms shifting between states of matter, as if the distinction between solid, liquid, and gas had become meaningless. Some retained enough human characteristics to suggest their origin as corrupted scholars, while others seemed to have emerged from the raw stuff of nightmare itself. Combat with these entities required techniques that Artorias had never needed to develop. His blessed sword could cut through their shifting forms, but conventional tactics, based on predicting enemy movement, proved useless against opponents whose very existence violated the principles of normal physics. Instead, he found himself fighting defensively, relying on his Covenant's protection to shield him from attacks that could not be dodged or blocked through normal means. The deeper chambers revealed the progressive stages of Oolacile's corruption in horrifying detail. Here were the workshops where scholars had first attempted to study the artifacts they had excavated, now transformed into laboratories where the laws of nature had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to alien principles. The research notes that remained legible told a story of gradual realization that their investigation had awakened something beyond their ability to control or comprehend. Among these corrupted laboratories, Artorias found the first solid clues to Princess Dusk's fate. Traces of her distinctive magical signature lingered in areas where she had clearly attempted to establish safe zones or research facilities within the spreading darknet. But the signatures grew progressively weaker and more distorted as he followed her trail deeper into the corruption, suggesting that even her considerable power was being steadily overwhelmed by forces that defied magical solution. The architecture of the deepest levels suggested that the corruption had its source in chambers that predated Oolacile's construction by centuries or millennia. These were not rooms built by human hands, according to human needs, but spaces carved from living rock according to principles that had more in common with natural caves than architectural design. The walls bore markings that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, symbols that hurt to look at directly and suggested meanings that human minds were not equipped to process. In these ancient chambers, Artorias began to encounter the true source of Oolacile's transformation. Here dwelt creatures that seemed to be composed of pure emotion, given physical form, beings of concentrated rage, despair, and loss, that existed as living expressions of psychological states, rather than conventional organisms. Their presence filled the air with oppressive weight that pressed against the Covenant Ring's protective barriers with increasing intensity. The emotional assault these entities represented was perhaps more dangerous than their physical capabilities. Where normal enemies could be defeated through superior skill or equipment, these manifestations of pure feeling attacked the psychological foundations that allowed Artorias to function as a rational being. Memories of loss and failure that he had long since processed and accepted began to resurface with renewed intensity, threatening to overwhelm his ability to maintain focus on his mission. It was here that the depth of his bond with Sif proved most crucial. The wolf's presence served as an anchor to positive emotions that could counterbalance the psychological assault of the corrupted chambers. When waves of artificial despair threatened to break through his mental defenses, Sif's unwavering loyalty and affection provided reminders of what he was fighting to protect. The relationship that had begun as tactical partnership had evolved into a form of mutual psychological support that proved essential for survival in these depths. Yet even this emotional anchor could not fully shield Artorias from the cumulative effects of prolonged exposure to concentrated corruption. With each step deeper into the transformed chambers, he could feel aspects of his personality beginning to shift in subtle but troubling ways. Thoughts that would normally have been dismissed as unworthy began to linger and grow, while convictions that had once seemed absolute started to seem arbitrary and questionable. The Covenant Ring's protection was holding against the direct assault of abyssal forces, but it could not prevent the more gradual influence that came from simply existing in proximity to such concentrated darkness. Artorias began to understand that his mission might exact a price that went beyond physical danger, that victory, if it could be achieved at all, might require sacrifices that would fundamentally change who he was. The chamber where he finally discovered Princess Dusk represented the deepest point of Oolacile's corruption, a space that existed at the boundary between normal reality and something that could only be called the Abyss itself. Here, the barriers between different states of existence had been worn so thin that multiple versions of events seemed to be occurring simultaneously, creating a confusing overlay of past, present, and potential futures. Princess Dusk hung suspended in this impossible space, her form flickering between states of presence and absence, as if the corruption could not decide whether she existed or not. Her condition was clearly beyond anything that conventional rescue techniques could address. She had become a prisoner of the space itself, trapped in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. The sight of the princess in this condition filled Artorias with a determination that burned through the psychological fog that had been clouding his thoughts. Here was a concrete objective, a specific person who could be saved if he could just find the right approach. All the abstract concerns about cosmic forces and philosophical implications faded before the immediate need to rescue someone who had trusted in his protection. But as he moved closer to attempt to rescue, Artorias began to realize that the princess was not simply a victim of the corruption, but had become an integral part of the forces that sustained it. Her magical abilities, considerable though they were, had been co-opted by the abyssal powers and now served to anchor the reality distortions that made the deepest chambers possible. Freeing her would require not just breaking her physical bonds, but severing connections that extended into dimensions of existence that normal magic could not reach. The effort to understand and address these supernatural constraints pushed Artorias' capabilities to their absolute limits. The techniques required to work with transdimensional magical structures were far beyond his training as a knight, requiring him to improvise based on theoretical knowledge gained from studying the Covenant Ring's mechanisms. Each attempt to manipulate the forces holding the princess prisoner risked destabilizing the protective barriers that kept him and Sif safe from the corruption that surrounded them. It was during these desperate attempts at rescue that Artorias first became aware of the presence that lurked in the deepest depths of the corrupted chambers. Something vast and ancient watched his efforts with an intelligence that was unmistakably hostile, something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of interference with its plans. The corruption of Oolacile had not been an accident, but a deliberate act designed to draw exactly the kind of hero who might pose a threat to larger schemes. The realization that he had walked into a trap designed specifically for someone with his abilities and protections filled Artorias with a cold fury that temporarily burned away the confusion and doubt that had been plaguing his thinking. He had been manipulated, led by his own heroic instincts into a situation where his greatest strengths could be turned against him. The rescue of Princess Dusk was not just a mission objective, but bait designed to bring him within reach of forces that could corrupt even divine protection. Yet this understanding, rather than leading to despair or retreat, crystallized Artorias' resolve into something harder and more focused than it had ever been. If dark powers sought to use his compassion against him, then he would demonstrate that true strength could not be corrupted through manipulation. If ancient entities believed they could turn his greatest virtues into weaknesses, then he would prove them wrong through the purity of his commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The confrontation that lay ahead would test every aspect of his training, equipment, and character. But Artorias faced it with the certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice, that the bonds of loyalty and love represented values that transcended even the cosmic forces that sought to destroy them. Whatever price victory might demand, whatever transformation it might require, he would pay it gladly for the chance to stand against the darkness that threatened everything he held dear. Chapter 6. The Father of the Abyss. In the deepest chamber of corrupted Oolacile, where reality itself seemed to pulse with malevolent life, Artorias came face to face with the source of all the horror he had witnessed. The being that the scholars had awakened from its ancient slumber was unlike anything in his experience. a creature that had once been human but had been transformed by forces so profound that almost nothing of its original nature remained recognizable. Manus, as the ancient texts would later name him, towered above the night like a living shadow, given form. His massive frame was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it, while his left arm had swollen to monstrous proportions, the hand transformed into a gaping maw lined with teeth that could extend far beyond its apparent reach. Most disturbing of all were the eyes, multiple red orbs that dotted his face and seemed to see across time and space with an intelligence that was both utterly alien and heartbreakingly human. The very presence of this primeval being sent waves of corruption, radiating outward, that tested the limits of Artorias's divine protection. The Covenant Ring blazed with protective light as it struggled to maintain a barrier between night and wolf and the reality-warping emanations that flowed from Manus like psychic radiation. Even with this protection, Artorias could feel the edges of his consciousness beginning to fray under the assault of emotions so powerful they had taken on physical form. This was grief made manifest, rage given substance, love twisted into something so profound and terrible that it could reshape the fundamental structures of existence. The being before him was not evil in any conventional sense, but suffering elevated to cosmic proportions, a consciousness whose capacity for feeling had been magnified beyond any mortal's ability to contain or process. Princess Dusk hung suspended in the space around Manus, like a living memory, her form flickering between presence and absence, as the ancient being's emotions held her trapped in a state that existed outside normal time. She was neither prisoner nor willing companion, but something more complex, a focal point for longings and losses that stretched back to ages before the current world order had been established. As Artorias watched, he began to understand the true tragedy of what confronted him. Manus was not a monster that had conquered and corrupted the princess, but a broken consciousness that had found in her something that reminded him of what he had lost when the scholars disturbed his peaceful slumber. The corruption of Oolacile, the reality distortions, the transformation of the kingdom's inhabitants, all of it stemmed from the uncontrolled emotional emanations of a being whose capacity for feeling exceeded any framework that could contain it. The pendant that had once anchored Manus to his humanity lay broken somewhere in the ruins above, its destruction having released psychological forces that had been contained for millennia. Without that connection to mortal emotion and memory, the ancient being had become something that existed purely in states of loss and longing, unable to process or integrate the experiences that defined his existence. Understanding the nature of his opponent filled Artorias with a mixture of pity and determination that crystallized into a resolve unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a consciousness to be freed from torment that had lasted far too long. Yet the method of that liberation would require a confrontation that could easily destroy both the one who sought to help and the one who needed that help. The battle that erupted when Manus finally became aware of Artorias' presence was unlike any combat the knight had ever experienced. This was not a contest of skill or strength, but a clash between different interpretations of reality itself. Each of Manus' attacks carried with it the weight of cosmic emotion, strikes that targeted not just the body, but the fundamental beliefs that allowed Artorias to function as a coherent personality. The great sword that had served the knight so faithfully in countless previous battles felt almost inadequate against an opponent whose very existence transcended the normal categories of life and death. Each successful blow seemed to cause Manus genuine pain, but the ancient being's form regenerated almost instantly, drawing upon reserves of power that appeared to be literally infinite. More challenging than the physical aspects of the confrontation was the psychological assault that accompanied every exchange. Fighting Manus meant exposing oneself to the full force of his emotional emanations, grief that could crush the spirit, rage that could burn away reason, and a love so pure and desperate that it became indistinguishable from hatred. These feelings were not artificially imposed, but seemed to arise from within Artorias' own consciousness, as if the battle was awakening responses that he had never known he possessed. It was during these moments of psychological vulnerability that Sif's presence became absolutely crucial. The great wolf's unwavering loyalty and affection provided an anchor to positive emotions that could counterbalance the overwhelming negativity that flowed from their opponent. When waves of artificial despair threatened to break through his mental defenses, Sif's courage reminded Artorias of why he fought and what he sought to protect. Yet, even this emotional support could not fully shield the knight from the cumulative effects of prolonged exposure to Manas's influence. With each exchange of blows, Artorias could feel aspects of his own personality beginning to resonate with the ancient being's torment. The losses he had experienced in his own life, the doubts about his mission that had begun in New Lundo, the growing questions about the righteousness of the divine order he served, all of these began to amplify and multiply under the influence of Manas's emanations. The turning point in the battle came when Artorias finally understood what was required to free both Manas and Princess Dusk from their supernatural prison. The ancient being's power was fueled by his inability to process and integrate the emotional trauma that had resulted from his violent awakening. What he needed was not destruction but healing, a way to reconnect with the mortal emotions that had once allowed him to exist peacefully alongside others. This realization led Artorias to make a choice that would define the rest of his existence. Rather than continuing to fight against Manas's influence, he began to open himself to it, allowing the ancient being's emotions to flow through his own consciousness, while using his divine protection to prevent them from overwhelming his personality entirely. It was an act of empathy so profound that it bordered on self-sacrifice, offering his own emotional stability as a bridge that might allow Manas to reconnect with his lost humanity. The process was agony beyond description. Feeling Manas's grief meant experiencing loss on a scale that dwarfed any personal tragedy. Understanding his rage meant confronting injustices that spanned millennia. Most difficult of all, touching his love meant accepting the reality of what could be lost when someone cared too deeply for things that could be taken away. But the technique worked. For the first time since his awakening, Manas began to experience emotions that were filtered through another consciousness. Feelings that were intense but not overwhelming, powerful but not destructive. Through Artorias' mediation, the ancient being began to remember what it felt like to be something other than pure suffering, given form. The change in Manas's condition created a cascade of effects throughout the corrupted chambers. As his emotional emanations began to stabilize, the reality distortions that had transformed Oolacile started to weaken. Princess Dusk's form became more solid and present as the supernatural forces that held her prisoner lost their grip on the fabric of reality itself. But the healing that Artorias was facilitating came at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent. Each moment of connection with Manas's consciousness left permanent changes in the knight's own psyche. The ancient being's perspective on existence, his understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality, his knowledge of humanity's true nature, all of this was flowing into Artorias' mind, whether he willed it or not. The most disturbing revelations concern the true history of the world that Artorias had dedicated his life to protecting. Through Manas's ancient memories, he began to see the Age of Fire not as the natural order of existence, but as an artificial construct, imposed by gods who feared what humanity might become if left to develop according to its own nature. The divine civilization he served was revealed as a system of control designed to prevent humans from accessing their full potential. These revelations struck at the core of everything Artorias believed about his purpose and mission. The righteousness he had always felt in serving Lord Gwyn became complicated by the understanding that this service was perpetuating a cosmic injustice. The enemies he had fought in New Lundo were not corrupted monsters, but humans who had simply chosen to embrace their true heritage rather than accepting artificial limitations. Yet even as his worldview crumbled around him, Artorias continued his efforts to heal Manos and free Princess Dusk. The immediate need to end suffering and save innocent life transcended the philosophical crisis that was tearing apart his understanding of good and evil. Whatever the larger implications of what he was learning, there remained people who needed his help. And that need gave meaning to his actions, even when everything else had become questionable. The process of healing Manus required more than just emotional connection. It demanded a form of spiritual fusion that went far beyond anything Artorias had been trained to attempt. He found himself sharing not just feelings but memories, experiences, and fundamental aspects of consciousness with a being whose perspective spanned ages that no mortal mind was equipped to process. Through this unprecedented connection, Artorias began to understand the true nature of the abyss itself. It was not an external force invading the world, but humanity's own essence, finally asserting itself after centuries of suppression. The darkness that seemed so threatening to divine order was actually the birthright that every human carried within their soul, the inheritance of the furtive pygmy who had chosen to divide his power among countless offspring rather than claiming dominion for himself. This understanding brought with it a terrible clarity about his own situation. The covenant ring that protected him from corruption was not just shielding him from external darkness, but preventing him from accessing aspects of his own nature that were as fundamental as his need for air or water. He was fighting against his own heritage in service to gods who viewed his entire species as a threat to their continued dominance. The internal conflict that resulted from these revelations created a fracture in Artorias' psyche that grew wider with each moment of connection to Manus. Part of him remained loyal to the ideals of knighthood and divine service that had defined his entire existence. But another part, growing stronger by the moment, recognized the justice in humanity's desire to reclaim what had been taken from them. This division within his own consciousness began to affect the healing process itself. The emotional stability that Artorias was providing to Manus became contaminated by his own psychological turmoil, creating feedback loops that amplified both beings' suffering rather than reducing it. The ancient being's grief resonated with the knight's growing sense of betrayal, while his rage found echoes in Artorias' fury at having been deceived about the nature of his mission. Sif, watching his master struggle with growing alarm, began to sense changes in Artorias that went far beyond the physical exhaustion of prolonged battle. The wolf's keen instincts detected shifts in the knight's spiritual emanations that suggested something fundamental was being altered at the deepest levels of his being. Yet the great wolf's loyalty remained absolute. Whatever Artorias was becoming, Sif would stand by his side. The climax of the healing process came when Artorias finally succeeded in reconnecting Manus with the memory of what he had lost, the pendant that had once anchored him to his humanity. Through the knight's mediation, the ancient being was able to experience not just the grief of that loss, but the love that had made the pendant meaningful in the first place. For a brief moment, Manus remembered what it felt like to be human rather than a force of nature. This moment of reconnection with his humanity allowed Manus to release Princess Dusk from the supernatural bonds that had held her prisoner. The sorceress materialized fully in the chamber, her form no longer flickering between states of existence. She was free, saved by Artorias' willingness to bridge the gap between ancient suffering and present compassion. But the cost of this victory was becoming increasingly apparent. The process of healing Manus had required Artorias to absorb aspects of the ancient being's nature that could not be simply discarded once the healing was complete. The knight who had descended into the depths of Oolacile was not the same as the one who now stood in the chamber where Manus had found a measure of peace. The corruption that Artorias had feared to face externally had instead worked its way into his consciousness through his own compassionate actions. The very empathy that made him a hero had become the means by which darkness had gained access to his soul. He had saved Princess Dusk and brought peace to Manus, but in doing so had sacrificed something essential about his own nature. Princess Dusk, now free but traumatized by her experiences, looked upon her rescuer with a mixture of gratitude and horror. She could see the changes that had taken place in Artorias during his battle with Manus. could recognize the signs of someone who had touched the abyss and been forever marked by the experience. The knight who had come to save her was himself now in need of salvation that she was powerless to provide. The retreat from the deepest chambers of Oolacile became a desperate race against the progressive corruption that was spreading through Artorias' consciousness. Each step toward the surface required him to fight against impulses and thoughts that were increasingly alien to his original nature. The covenant ring that had protected him from external influence could do nothing against corruption that was emerging from within his own transformed psyche. Sif stayed close to his master throughout this agonizing journey, the wolf's presence serving as the last anchor to the knight's original personality. But even this powerful bond was being tested by the changes that were overtaking Artorias. The great wolf could sense that something precious was being lost, something that might never be recovered, no matter how loyal his devotion remained. As they finally emerged from the corrupted depths into the relatively normal spaces of Upper Oolacile, Artorias was forced to confront the full scope of what he had become. The mission had been successful. Princess Dusk was safe, Manus was at peace, and the spreading corruption had been contained. But the knight who had achieved these victories was no longer the same person who had accepted the mission in the first place. The transformation was not simply a matter of new knowledge or changed perspective, but a fundamental alteration in the structure of his consciousness itself. The connection with Manus had left him with capacities and impulses that belonged more to the abyss than to the divine order he had served. He could feel darkness moving within his soul like a living thing, patient and powerful and utterly alien to everything he had once believed about his own nature. The realization that he had become the very thing he had been sent to fight filled Artorias with a despair that was all the more crushing for being mixed with understanding. He could see the justice in humanity's desire to reclaim its heritage, could recognize the artificial nature of the constraints that had been placed upon his species, but he could also see what embracing that heritage might cost, not just for himself, but for everyone who looked to him for protection and guidance. The choice that faced him was no longer between success and failure in his mission, but between accepting what he had become and fighting against it. He could embrace the dark knowledge and power that his connection with Manus had given him, using it to champion humanity's cause against divine oppression. Or he could resist the transformation, holding on to what remained of his original nature, even if doing so meant internal torment and eventual destruction. Either path led to tragedy. Embracing the darkness would mean betraying everything he had once stood for, while resisting it would mean denying the truth about his own nature and the injustices he had unknowingly perpetuated. The hero who had descended into Oolacile to save others now found himself in need of salvation that no external force could provide. As he stood in the ruins of the kingdom he had helped save, surrounded by the evidence of corruption that mirrored the changes taking place within his own soul, Artorias made the only choice that his remaining honor would allow. He would not inflict his transformed nature upon those who trusted him, would not allow his growing darkness to spread to others as Manus's had spread through Oolacile. The great shield that had protected him through countless battles would serve one final purpose, not as a tool of war, but as an instrument of mercy. With his last act of clear thought and noble purpose, Artorias used his shield to create a barrier of light around Sif, protecting the wolf from the corruption that was consuming his master. It was a gesture of love so pure that it transcended the darkness that was claiming him, a final expression of the heroic spirit that had defined his entire career. Chapter 7. The Knight's Final Hour. The barrier of light that surrounded Sif pulsed with the last pure emanations of Artorias' original nature, a desperate gift from a master who could no longer trust himself to remain the protector his beloved companion deserved. The great wolf pressed against the luminous shield, sensing the finality of the separation and understanding, with the intuitive wisdom that had always characterized their relationship, that something irreversible was taking place. Within the protective barrier, Sif was safe from the corruption that was progressively claiming Artorias, but the wolf was also powerless to help with the internal battle that was tearing his master apart. The knight, who had always been a source of strength and certainty, now stood racked by convulsions of spirit that seemed to shake his very being. The confident warrior who had faced every previous challenge with unwavering resolve was now engaged in a conflict where victory and defeat had become indistinguishable. The transformation was not sudden but gradual, a slow eclipse of the light that had always defined Artorias' character. The knowledge gained from his connection with Manus continued to work its way through his consciousness like a poison that was also a cure, revealing truths that were simultaneously liberating and devastating. Every moment brought new understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped existence, but each revelation stripped away another layer of the comfortable certainties that had previously guided his actions. The worst part was the growing recognition that the darkness now spreading through his soul was not entirely foreign. The capacity for the transformation he was undergoing had always existed within him, dormant but present, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to awaken it. The corruption was not conquering him, but revealing aspects of his nature that he had never been allowed to acknowledge or develop. This realization brought with it a fury that burned through the confusion and despair that had been clouding his thoughts. He had been lied to, manipulated, used as a tool to perpetuate injustices that his own moral code should have led him to oppose. The gods he had served with such devotion viewed him and his entire species as a threat to be contained rather than allies to be valued. Every mission he had undertaken, every victory he had achieved, had served to strengthen a system designed to deny humans their rightful place in the cosmic order. Yet even as this righteous anger clarified his understanding of how he had been deceived, it also accelerated the transformation that was consuming him. The emotion was too pure, too powerful for his original personality structure to contain. It burned through the psychological frameworks that had previously organized his thoughts and responses, leaving behind something that was undeniably him, but also undeniably changed. The sword that had been his constant companion throughout his career began to reflect these internal changes. The blessed steel that had once gleamed with divine light now seemed to drink illumination from its surroundings, its edge taking on properties that had more in common with the weapons wielded by the dark wraiths he had once fought. The transformation of his equipment served as external confirmation of what was happening within his soul. Standing in the ruins of Oolacile, surrounded by the evidence of corruption that he had helped to contain but could not entirely eliminate, Artorias felt the last vestiges of his original identity beginning to slip away. The knight who had descended into these depths no longer existed in any meaningful sense. What remained was something new, a being that retained his memories and skills, but operated according to principles that would have horrified his former self. The change was not entirely unwelcome. Along with the loss of his original nature came a freedom from the moral constraints that had previously limited his actions. He could see solutions to problems that his earlier self would never have considered, could contemplate strategies that his knightly code would have forbidden. The darkness that was claiming him offered power beyond anything he had possessed as a servant of the divine order. But with this liberation came a terrible loneliness. The transformation that was giving him new capabilities was also cutting him off from everything that had previously given his existence meaning. The bonds of loyalty and affection that had defined his relationships were being strained beyond their capacity to endure. Even his connection with Sif, the strongest tie to his original nature, was being threatened by the changes that made him increasingly alien to his former self. The great wolf could sense the internal struggle that was tearing his master apart, could see the battle between light and darkness being fought within a soul that had once seemed unshakable in its commitment to righteousness. Sif's loyalty remained absolute, but the wolf's understanding of what that loyalty might require was evolving to match the changes in Artorias. If his master was becoming something dark, then Sif would follow him into darkness. If the knight was transforming into a creature that others would fear and hunt, then the wolf would stand beside him against whatever enemies might come. This unwavering devotion from his companion provided Artorias with both comfort and anguish. Sif's loyalty was a reminder of the good he had once represented, but it was also a responsibility that his transformed nature might not be able to honor. The love between knight and wolf was pure and genuine, but love alone might not be enough to bridge the gap between what Artorias had been and what he was becoming. The decision of what to do with his transformed state was not one that Artorias felt qualified to make alone. The darkness within him whispered of opportunities to reshape the world, according to principles of justice that his original nature had been too constrained to pursue. He could become a champion of humanity's true heritage, leading his species in a rebellion against the divine forces that had oppressed them for so long. The power was available, the justification was clear, and the need was undeniable. But the remnants of his original conscience recoiled from the implications of such a path. The methods that would be required to overthrow the divine order would involve exactly the kind of violence and manipulation that he had spent his career opposing. To become a liberator, he would have to embrace the role of destroyer. To save humanity, he might have to become the very monster that his former self would have fought to defeat. The internal conflict between these competing visions of his purpose and identity created a form of psychological torture that was almost unbearable. Every course of action seemed to require betraying something essential about who he was or who he might become. The transformation that had given him new understanding had also trapped him in a maze of moral ambiguity, where no choice could be made without causing harm to something he valued. It was in this state of spiritual agony that Artorias finally understood what Manis had experienced during his own transformation. The ancient being's rage and grief had not been the products of simple evil, but the natural responses of a consciousness forced to confront impossible choices between competing forms of love and loyalty. The corruption that had seemed so monstrous from the outside was revealed as a form of suffering that exceeded any individual's capacity to bear. This understanding brought with it a terrible compassion for his former enemy, but it also served as a warning about what Artorias himself might become if the transformation continued unchecked. The power that was flowing through him was the same force that had turned Manis into a creature of pure emotion and destructive capability. Without some form of anchor to his original nature, he risked losing himself entirely in the cosmic forces that were reshaping his consciousness. The barrier of light surrounding Sith began to pulse with increasing intensity as Artorias' internal struggle reached its climax. The protective shield was drawing upon reserves of pure intention that were being rapidly depleted by the knight's psychological turmoil. Soon, the barrier would fail, leaving the wolf vulnerable to corruption that might transform him as thoroughly as it was transforming his master. The prospect of Sith sharing his fate filled Artorias with a horror that cut through all the philosophical considerations that had been paralyzing his decision-making. Whatever else he might become, whatever price he might have to pay for his transformation, he would not allow the pure heart of his companion to be touched by the darkness that was claiming him. The wolf's innocence was worth preserving, even if it meant accepting permanent separation from the only being who had ever loved him unconditionally. The choice, when it finally came, was not the result of careful deliberation, but of instinctive recognition of what love required. Using the last clear moment of his original consciousness, Artorias poured his remaining pure intention into strengthening the barrier around Sith. Making it permanent and unbreachable, the wolf would be safe from corruption, protected by a shield that would endure long after its creator had been consumed by the forces he could no longer resist. With this final act of protection complete, Artorias felt the last constraints on his transformation fall away. The darkness that had been building within him rushed forward like a tide that had finally broken through its barriers. His consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that spanned ages, while his understanding of cosmic forces deepened to levels that his original mind could never have processed. The knight who had entered Oolacile to save Princess Dusk and defeat the spreading corruption was gone, replaced by something that retained his memories and skills, but operated according to principles that belonged more to the abyss than to the divine order he had once served. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and terrible in its implications for everything he had once held dear. Yet, even in this transformed state, some essential core of what had made Artorias great remained intact. The love for Sith that had motivated his final act of protection continued to burn within his darkened consciousness like a star in the void. The commitment to defending the innocent that had defined his career found new expression in his determination to guard the barriers that kept his corruption contained. The corrupted knight who emerged from the depths of Oolacile was no longer the hero who had descended there, but neither was he the mindless monster that many who fell to abyssal influence became. He was something new and unprecedented, a being that bridged the gap between light and darkness, carrying within himself both the nobility of his original nature and the terrible knowledge of what humanity might become when freed from divine constraints. This duality would define everything about his existence in the time that remained to him. He was simultaneously protector and threat, savior and destroyer, the greatest knight of his age, and its most dangerous fallen champion. The abyss had claimed him, but it had not entirely consumed him. What remained was a tragedy of such scope and complexity that it would echo through the ages, inspiring both fear and sympathy in all who encountered the legend of Artorias the Abysswalker. Chapter 8. The Guardian's Vigil. In the depths of the chasm of the abyss, where reality bent according to the will of primordial darkness, the transformed Artorias began his eternal vigil. The knight, who had once served the gods with unwavering devotion, now found himself guardian of the very forces he had been trained to oppose, protecting the world from the corruption that had claimed him, while simultaneously ensuring that the truth he had discovered would not be entirely lost. The space where he made his stand existed outside normal time and geography, a pocket of concentrated darkness that served as both prison and sanctuary. Here, the laws that governed the surface world held no sway, allowing beings touched by the abyss to exist in states that would be impossible elsewhere. It was a realm where past and present overlapped, where memory and reality intertwined, where the boundaries between different forms of consciousness became negotiable. Artorias's role in this strange realm was complex and contradictory. To the corrupted creatures that dwelt in the deeper reaches of the abyss, he was a guardian and guide, helping them navigate the psychological challenges of existence in a state that transcended normal human consciousness. His own successful integration of abyssal knowledge with remnants of his original nature made him uniquely qualified to assist others who were struggling with similar transformations. Yet, to any being of light that might venture into these depths, he represented an insurmountable obstacle. The corruption that had claimed him was virulent and powerful, capable of overwhelming even strong-willed individuals who lacked specific protections against abyssal influence. His very presence in the realm served as a warning to those who would seek to penetrate too deeply into mysteries that their minds were not equipped to handle. The sword that had once gleamed with divine blessing now pulsed with dark energy that seemed to drink light from the air around it. Each strike carried with it not just physical force, but spiritual weight that could crush the resolve of those who faced it. The techniques that had made him legendary as a knight of the light had been preserved, but transformed, becoming expressions of a power that belonged to an entirely different cosmic order. His movements through the twisted geography of the abyss had a purpose that went beyond simple patrolling. Artorias was searching for something, fragments of memory and meaning, that might allow him to piece together a more complete understanding of what he had become and what role he was meant to play in the cosmic drama that was unfolding around him. The knowledge gained from his connection with Manus was vast, but fragmented, requiring patient exploration to fully comprehend. The creatures he encountered in these depths were not the mindless monsters that surface dwellers might expect, but beings that had undergone their own transformations in response to contact with abyssal forces. Each one carried a story of change and loss, of original natures that had been dissolved and reformed according to principles that transcended individual identity. In many of them, Artorias could see reflections of his own journey from light into darkness. Some of these beings retained enough of their original personalities to communicate in ways that approximated normal conversation. From them, Artorias learned of the broader patterns that governed existence in the abyss, the hierarchies and relationships that had developed among those who had been transformed by exposure to humanity's true heritage. It was a complex society unlike anything that existed in the surface world, organized around principles of shared transformation rather than individual achievement. The most disturbing discovery in these depths was evidence of other knights who had preceded him into the abyss, warriors who had faced similar missions and undergone similar transformations. Their equipment lay scattered through the twisted chambers, each piece telling a story of someone who had started as a champion of light and ended as something entirely different. Artorias was not unique in his fall from grace, but part of a pattern that stretched back through ages of conflict between divine authority and humanity's suppressed nature. These revelations forced him to confront the possibility that his own mission to Oolacile had been orchestrated with full knowledge of what the likely outcome would be. The gods who had sent him to face Manus might have expected or even desired his corruption, using his heroic nature as a means to contain and control forces that they could not safely approach themselves. His transformation might not have been a tragic accident, but a calculated sacrifice designed to serve purposes he was only beginning to understand. The rage that this possibility inspired burned through his consciousness like acid, dissolving more of the psychological structures that connected him to his original nature. Each moment of clarity about how he had been manipulated pushed him further from the knight he had been, and closer to something that existed purely as an expression of cosmic justice denied. The emotions were too powerful for any individual consciousness to contain safely, threatening to complete the process that had begun with his exposure to Manus's suffering. It was in these moments of greatest psychological danger that the memory of Sif provided the anchor that kept him from dissolving entirely into the abyssal forces that surrounded him. The pure love and loyalty that the wolf had shown him represented something that transcended the political and cosmic considerations that had led to his corruption. That bond was real and meaningful, regardless of what larger purposes his transformation might serve. The barrier of light that protected Sif in the world above became a focal point for whatever remained of Artorias' original nature. Maintaining that protection required him to preserve at least some connection to the principles and emotions that had motivated his heroic career. The wolf's safety depended on his ability to resist complete dissolution into darkness, giving him a purpose that existed independent of any cosmic agenda. This responsibility for Sif's welfare created a strange form of discipline within his transformed consciousness. The parts of his nature that were being claimed by abyssal influence had to be balanced against the parts that were necessary for protecting someone who depended on him. The result was a personality that operated simultaneously as dark champion and loving guardian, embodying contradictions that would have been impossible in a less transformed state. The vigil that Artorias maintained in the depths of the abyss gradually took on ritualistic qualities that helped him organize his fractured consciousness around meaningful purposes. He would patrol the boundaries between different levels of corruption, ensuring that beings who were undergoing transformation had the time and space necessary to complete the process safely. He would stand guard against incursions from forces that sought to exploit the psychological vulnerability of those who were caught between human and abyssal nature. Most importantly, he served as a living bridge between different forms of consciousness, helping beings from various states of transformation to communicate and cooperate, despite the fundamental differences in their nature. His own experience of existing simultaneously as knight and abyssal entity gave him unique insights into the challenges of maintaining identity across such dramatic changes. The passage of time in the abyss followed patterns that had little in common with surface chronology, but Artorias gradually became aware that ages were passing in the world above. The cosmic conflict between light and dark was continuing to unfold, with new heroes rising to face challenges that echoed his own journey into corruption. Each cycle brought warriors who were slightly better prepared or slightly more resistant to the forces they faced, but none who could entirely escape the fundamental contradictions that had destroyed his own certainty. Occasionally, the barriers between the abyss and the surface world would thin enough to allow glimpses of what was happening above. Through these windows, Artorias could see that his legend was growing, that stories of his heroism and his fall were being told in ways that both honored and distorted the truth of what had actually occurred. He had become a symbol that meant different things to different people, representing both the heights that human courage could reach and the dangers that awaited those who ventured too far into forbidden knowledge. The most painful of these glimpses revealed Sif, still guarding the grave where Artorias' equipment and legend rested, still protected by the barrier of light that his master had created with his final act of pure intention. The great wolf had grown larger and more majestic over the years, but had never abandoned his vigil or forgotten the bond that connected him to the knight, who could no longer openly acknowledge his presence. Seeing Sif's continued loyalty across such vast stretches of time filled Artorias with emotions that were almost too intense for his transformed nature to contain. The love and gratitude he felt burned through his consciousness like purifying fire, temporarily restoring aspects of his original personality that had been buried under layers of abyssal influence. In these moments, he remembered not just what he had been, but what he had hoped to become before his transformation had changed everything. These periodic renewals of his original nature served to prevent his complete dissolution into the collective consciousness of the abyss, maintaining enough individual identity to make his role as guardian and bridge meaningful. But they also brought with them renewed awareness of everything he had lost, everything he could never again be or have. The price of maintaining enough humanity to protect Sif was the constant reminder of what that protection was costing him. As the cycles continued and new challenges arose in the world above, Artorias began to understand that his vigil in the abyss was not just about protecting others from corruption, but about preserving something essential for future generations who might find better ways to navigate the conflicts between light and dark. His transformation, rather than being simply a personal tragedy, was serving as a form of cosmic research, demonstrating what was possible when divine and abyssal forces were integrated rather than simply opposed. The knowledge he was accumulating through his existence in multiple states of consciousness simultaneously was unprecedented in its scope and depth. He was learning how to maintain individual identity while accessing collective wisdom, how to preserve moral purpose while embracing transformative power, how to love and protect while accepting fundamental changes in one's own nature. These lessons might prove crucial for future heroes who would face similar choices with better preparation and understanding. Yet the cost of this knowledge remained almost unbearable. Each insight into the nature of existence came at the price of further separation from everything he had once held dear. The wisdom he was gaining was real and valuable, but it was purchased with a form of suffering that stretched across dimensions of experience that normal consciousness could not even perceive. The vigil continued, would always continue, as long as the conflict between light and dark remained unresolved. Artorias had become a permanent feature of the cosmic landscape, a being whose existence served purposes larger than any individual life could normally encompass. He was simultaneously prisoner and guardian, victim and protector, a living symbol of both the possibilities and the dangers that awaited those who sought to bridge the gap between opposing forces. In the depths of the abyss, surrounded by the evidence of transformations that had claimed countless others, the knight, who had once served the gods with unwavering loyalty, stood watch over mysteries that would shape the destiny of all who came after him. His vigil was a form of service that transcended any formal oath or divine mandate, motivated by love and maintained through sacrifices that few could understand or appreciate. Chapter 9. The Cycle of Legend. In the world above the abyss, where mortals struggled with challenges that seemed overwhelming but were merely echoes of deeper cosmic conflicts, the legend of Artorias began to take on a life of its own. The true story of what had happened in Oolacile was known only to a few, and even they possessed only fragments of the complete narrative. What emerged in its place was a mythologized version that served the needs of those who told it, rather than honoring the complexity of what had actually occurred. To the knights and warriors who came after him, Artorias represented the pinnacle of martial achievement, a hero whose skill and dedication had elevated him to legendary status. The details of his corruption were either unknown or deliberately obscured, allowing his image to serve as inspiration for those who sought to follow in his footsteps. Training academies throughout the realms used his techniques and philosophy as the foundation for their curricula, producing generations of warriors who modeled themselves on someone they could never truly understand. The irony was not lost on those few who knew the complete story. The knights who sought to emulate Artorias were striving to become something that had ultimately proven inadequate to the challenges it faced. The very virtues that they admired in their legendary predecessor, his unwavering loyalty, his absolute dedication to duty, his refusal to compromise his principles, were the same qualities that had made him vulnerable to the corruption that destroyed him. Yet there was also wisdom in the simplified version of his legend. The courage and selflessness that Artorias had displayed, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others, remained admirable regardless of the ultimate outcome of his mission. Young warriors who drew inspiration from his example might lack the complete context of his story, but they were still choosing to dedicate themselves to values that transcended personal advancement or comfort. The equipment that bore his name became objects of reverence and desire throughout the warrior communities of various kingdoms. Swords forged in imitation of his great blade, armor crafted to replicate his distinctive blue coloring, shields designed to echo the protective qualities of his famous defense. All of these became symbols of aspiration for those who sought to achieve similar greatness. The fact that the originals lay cursed and corrupted in the depths of the abyss was a detail that most preferred not to contemplate. The Covenant of Artorias, the ring that had once protected him from abyssal corruption, became the subject of intense scholarly research and magical experimentation. Craftsmen and enchanters worked for years to understand and replicate its protective properties, driven by the belief that such defenses might allow future heroes to succeed where their predecessor had failed. What they failed to understand was that the ring's power was as much a trap as a protection, creating exactly the kind of false confidence that made catastrophic mistakes possible. Some of these attempts to recreate Artorias' equipment and abilities led to new tragedies as ambitious warriors sought shortcuts to legendary status. Knights who wore inferior copies of his Covenant ring ventured into dangers they were not prepared to face, believing themselves protected by divine power that was either absent or inadequate. Their failures served as cautionary tales, but they also reinforced the mystique surrounding the original artifacts and their creator. The Abyss Watchers, a legion of knights who explicitly dedicated themselves to continuing Artorias' mission, represented perhaps the most organized attempt to learn from his example while avoiding his fate. They studied his techniques obsessively, developed new approaches to fighting abyssal corruption, and created organizational structures designed to prevent any individual from bearing the kind of responsibility that had ultimately overwhelmed their inspiration. Yet, even the Abyss Watchers could not escape the fundamental contradiction that lay at the heart of their mission. They were trying to fight against humanity's own nature in service to a divine order that viewed their entire species as a potential threat. Their dedication and skill were genuine, but they were applied in service to a cause that was ultimately self-defeating. The corruption they sought to prevent was not an external invasion, but an internal awakening that could only be delayed, never permanently stopped. The pattern repeated across generations and kingdoms, with new heroes rising to face challenges that were fundamentally similar to those that had defeated Artorias. Each cycle brought warriors who were better equipped or differently trained, who possessed new techniques or superior understanding of the forces they opposed. But none could entirely escape the underlying tensions that made victory impossible to achieve through force alone. Some of these later heroes learned enough about the true nature of their challenges to make different choices than Artorias had made. Rather than fighting against abyssal influence, they sought to understand and integrate it. Rather than viewing darkness as corruption to be purged, they recognized it as heritage to be reclaimed. These individuals often achieved different forms of success, but their victories came at costs that were no less significant than those paid by knights who had chosen more traditional paths. The stories of these alternative approaches were rarely included in the official legends that commemorated Artorias' career. The institutions that perpetuated his memory had little interest in promoting narratives that might undermine faith in the cosmic order they served. Heroes who had found ways to work with darkness rather than opposing it were either forgotten entirely or transformed into cautionary tales about the dangers of compromise and moral flexibility. This selective preservation of history created a form of institutional blindness that ensured future generations would continue to repeat the same fundamental mistake. Each new hero who arose to face abyssal corruption was given the same incomplete information, the same inadequate tools, and the same impossible mission parameters that had doomed their predecessors. The cycle of heroic failure was maintained not through malice, but through the refusal to acknowledge truths that might require uncomfortable changes in policy and worldview. Sif's role in perpetuating this cycle was both tragic and essential. The Great Wolf remained at his master's grave, serving as guardian of both the legend and the reality of what Artorias had become. To most who encountered him, Sif represented loyalty and devotion worthy of emulation. The wolf's vigil was seen as proof that the bonds between knight and companion could transcend even death, inspiring countless tales of similar partnerships throughout the warrior cultures of various realms. But for those few who possessed the insight to understand what they were seeing, Sif's presence told a more complex story. The wolf was not just guarding a grave, but maintaining a barrier between the world of light and the abyss that had claimed his master. His vigilance was not simply emotional but functional, serving to contain forces that could spread corruption to anyone who lacked proper protection. The loyalty that seemed so admirable was actually a form of cosmic responsibility that bound him to his post regardless of personal cost. The Great Wolf had grown both larger and wiser during his long vigil, his understanding of the cosmic forces at work deepening through years of proximity to the barriers between light and dark. He could sense when individuals approached his territory with genuine need for the tools that lay buried with his master, could distinguish between those who might use such power responsibly and those who would merely add to the sum of suffering in the world. These judgments were not made according to any formal criteria, but through the same intuitive wisdom that had always characterized Sif's approach to complex problems. The wolf could perceive the spiritual condition of those who sought access to Artorias' legacy, could recognize the difference between heroes who possessed the emotional maturity to handle dangerous knowledge and warriors who were driven primarily by ego or ambition. When worthy individuals did appear, Sif would allow them to face the trials necessary to claim what they needed from the gravesite. But these encounters were always tinged with sadness, as the wolf was forced to fight against people he would rather have befriended, testing their resolve and worthiness through combat that served purposes they could not fully understand. Each battle was simultaneously a gift and a burden, offering opportunities for growth while demanding sacrifices that left all participants changed. The most significant of these encounters occurred when individuals appeared who carried within themselves the same potential for transformation that had ultimately claimed Artorias. These rare heroes possessed the spiritual strength to face abyssal corruption without being immediately overwhelmed, but they also carried the same vulnerability to gradual influence that had made their predecessors fall possible. For these special cases, Sif's role became even more complex. The wolf served not just as guardian and judge, but as teacher, providing wordless lessons about the nature of loyalty, sacrifice, and the prices that must be paid for protecting what one loves. Through their encounters with him, these heroes gained insights into the emotional dimensions of their mission that no formal training could have provided. Some of these worthy individuals chose paths that diverged significantly from Artorias' example. Rather than accepting the isolation that had made their predecessor vulnerable to corruption, they sought to build networks of support and understanding that might prove more resilient against the psychological pressures of their calling. They recognized that the very individualism that made heroes effective also created the conditions that made their eventual fall almost inevitable. Others learned to question the missions they were given more carefully, recognizing that the authorities who dispatched them might not always possess complete information about the nature of the challenges they would face. These heroes developed strategies for gathering independent intelligence, for verifying the assumptions underlying their orders, and for adapting their approaches based on what they discovered in the field, rather than what they had been told to expect. The most successful of these later heroes learned to view their relationship with darkness as a form of ongoing negotiation rather than a simple conflict to be won or lost. They understood that the forces they faced were not external enemies, but aspects of their own nature that required integration rather than destruction. This approach demanded a level of self-awareness and emotional maturity that traditional knightly training rarely provided, but it offered possibilities for resolution that pure opposition could never achieve. Yet, even these more sophisticated approaches carried their own risks and limitations. Heroes who sought to integrate abyssal influence sometimes found themselves changed in ways that their allies could not accept or understand. The very flexibility that allowed them to avoid Artorias' specific fate could make them seem unreliable or compromised to those who preferred the clarity of absolute moral positions. The societies that produced these heroes were often unprepared for the complexity of the solutions they developed. Communities that had expected clear victories over evil found themselves confronting questions about the nature of good and evil that challenged their fundamental assumptions about morality and justice. The heroes who returned from successful missions sometimes carried with them perspectives that were more troubling than reassuring to those who had sent them forth. This created a tension between the practical needs of cosmic conflict resolution and the psychological needs of the communities that heroes were supposed to serve. The most effective approaches to abyssal corruption often required embracing truths that ordinary people were not prepared to accept, creating isolation and misunderstanding that could be as destructive as any external threat. Artorias' legend served different functions for different groups within this complex landscape. For traditionalists, who preferred simple moral categories, he remained the perfect knight, whose fall was a tragic aberration rather than a predictable consequence of fundamental flaws in their worldview. For those who questioned the wisdom of divine authority, he became a symbol of the costs imposed by an unjust cosmic order that demanded impossible sacrifices from its servants. The truth, as preserved in the deepest levels of scholarly research and mystical investigation, was more complex than either interpretation could fully capture. Artorias had been both victim and agent of the forces that destroyed him, both hero and cautionary tale, both inspiration and warning. His story contained lessons for those wise enough to understand them, but it also demonstrated the limitations of any individual's ability to resolve conflicts that extended across cosmic dimensions. The ongoing cycle of heroic missions and tragic outcomes that his legend helped perpetuate served purposes that extended beyond the immediate needs of any particular crisis. Each generation of heroes who faced similar challenges added to the accumulated knowledge about the nature of abyssal corruption and the possibilities for human response to it. Their failures were as instructive as their successes, providing data that might eventually allow future heroes to find better solutions. Yet this gradual accumulation of wisdom came at a cost measured in individual lives and shattered ideals. Each hero who fell to corruption or despair, each knight who discovered that their cause was more complex than they had been taught, each warrior who found themselves isolated by truths they could not share, all of these were paying prices for lessons that might benefit people they would never meet. The memorial sites that commemorated these various heroes became focal points for reflection on the nature of sacrifice and service. Pilgrims who visited these locations often found themselves confronting questions about their own willingness to pay similar prices, their own capacity for the kind of dedication that had elevated these individuals to legendary status. Sif's vigil at Artorias' grave became perhaps the most powerful of these memorial sites, offering visitors a living example of loyalty that transcended individual mortality. The wolf's continued presence served as proof that some bonds were stronger than death, that love could persist across transformations that seemed to destroy everything meaningful about existence. But for those who understood the complete context of Sif's situation, the Great Wolf's Vigil also served as a reminder of the ongoing nature of the cosmic conflicts that had claimed so many heroes. The barriers between light and dark remained fragile, requiring constant maintenance and protection. The peace that most people enjoyed was purchased through the vigilance of beings who could never fully share in that peace themselves. The legend of Artorias thus became a lens through which each generation could examine its own relationship to questions of duty, sacrifice, and moral complexity. His story offered both inspiration and warning, both example to follow and cautionary tale to avoid. The very ambiguity of his legacy ensured that it would remain relevant as long as heroes continued to face impossible choices in service to causes that exceeded their individual understanding. In the end, perhaps this was the most fitting memorial for a knight whose own journey had been defined by the tension between simple moral clarity and complex cosmic reality. Artorias had begun his career with certainty about the nature of good and evil, but his greatest trial had forced him to confront truths that shattered those certainties while revealing deeper forms of meaning and purpose. His legend preserved both aspects of this journey, the inspiring dedication of his early career and the tragic complexity of his ultimate fate. Those who encountered his story could draw from it whatever lessons they were prepared to understand, while leaving the deeper mysteries intact for those who might someday prove capable of wisdom that had been beyond the reach of previous generations. The cycle would continue, as it always had, with new heroes rising to face challenges that echoed ancient patterns while taking new forms. Each generation would interpret Artorias' legacy according to its own needs and understanding, adding new layers of meaning to a story that had already transcended the boundaries of individual biography to become mythology. And in the depths of the abyss, the knight whose transformation had begun this legendary cycle continued his own eternal vigil, serving purposes that extended far beyond any single story or lifetime, watching over barriers that protected a world that had largely forgotten both his sacrifice and his name. Epilogue: The Eternal Guardian. As our journey through the tragic tale of Artorias, the Abysswalker, draws to its close, we find ourselves confronting the same fundamental questions that have haunted every retelling of his story. What does it mean to be a hero when heroism itself can become a form of corruption? How do we honor sacrifice while acknowledging that some sacrifices might have been unnecessary? And what lessons can we draw from a legend that seems to offer as many warnings as inspiration? The story of Artorias is ultimately about the price of knowledge and the cost of good intentions. Here was a knight who possessed every virtue that his society valued: courage, loyalty, skill, dedication to protecting others. Yet these very virtues became the mechanisms of his downfall when he encountered forces that operated according to principles he had never been taught to understand. His tragedy was not the result of moral failure or personal weakness, but of institutional blindness that left him unprepared for the true nature of the challenges he would face. The gods who sent him on his final mission gave him tools designed to fight corruption from the outside, never acknowledging that the deepest forms of corruption might come from within. They armed him against external enemies, while leaving him vulnerable to the revolution of consciousness that would ultimately claim him. Yet even in his fall, Artorias achieved something that pure victory might not have accomplished. His transformation provided a bridge between opposing forces that had seemed irreconcilably hostile, demonstrating that integration might be possible, even in cases where traditional triumph was not. The knowledge he gained through his connection with Manus, the understanding he developed about the true nature of humanity's heritage, the wisdom he accumulated through his existence in multiple states of consciousness simultaneously, all of this became part of a legacy that transcended his individual fate. The great wolf Sif, still maintaining his vigil in the world above, serves as a living reminder that some forms of love transcend any transformation or tragedy. The loyalty between knight and companion proved stronger than corruption, more enduring than death, more meaningful than any cosmic agenda. In Sif's unwavering dedication, we see proof that the bonds formed through genuine affection can survive even the most devastating changes in circumstance or nature. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson that Artorias' story has to offer, that meaning does not depend on success, that heroism can persist even through failure, and that love can find expression even in the most impossible circumstances. The knight who descended into Oolacile to save Princess Dusk and contain the spreading corruption accomplished his immediate objectives, but at a cost that transformed him into something his original self would have feared and fought. Yet that transformation was not simply loss, but also revelation. Through his connection with the Abyss, Artorias gained access to truths about existence that no untransformed consciousness could have understood. He learned that the cosmic conflict between light and dark was not as simple as he had been taught, that both sides of the struggle contained elements of justice and injustice, wisdom and folly. This knowledge came at a price that few would be willing to pay, but it also provided insights that might prove crucial for future generations who will face similar choices with better preparation and understanding. Artorias' sacrifice was not in vain if it helps others avoid the same mistakes, if it provides data that can be used to develop more effective approaches to cosmic conflict resolution. The legend that has grown around his story serves multiple functions in the ongoing cultural memory of his world. For those who prefer simple moral categories, he remains an inspiring example of dedication and courage. For those who question the wisdom of absolute loyalty to any authority, he becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of unexamined obedience. For those who seek to understand the deeper mysteries of existence, he represents a bridge between different forms of consciousness that might otherwise remain forever isolated from each other. All of these interpretations contain elements of truth, but none captures the complete complexity of what actually occurred. Artorias was simultaneously hero and victim, savior and destroyer, inspiration and warning. His story cannot be reduced to simple lessons or comfortable morals, because the forces that shaped his fate operate on scales that exceed individual comprehension. The ongoing cycle of heroes who follow in his footsteps, each facing challenges that echo his journey while taking new forms, suggests that his story is far from finished. Each new knight who ventures into darkness carrying tools and knowledge derived from his example, each warrior who must choose between loyalty and truth, each individual who discovers that their deepest beliefs about reality might be incomplete or misleading. All of these are continuing the narrative that began with his transformation. In the depths of the abyss, where time moves according to different principles and consciousness takes forms that surface dwellers cannot imagine, the transformed Artorias continues his eternal vigil. He stands guard over barriers that protect a world that has largely forgotten his sacrifice, maintaining protections that preserve the possibility of future choices by those who might prove wiser than their predecessors. His existence in that transformed state serves purposes that extend beyond any individual story or lifetime. He has become a permanent feature of the cosmic landscape, a being whose role in maintaining the balance between opposing forces will continue as long as such balance remains necessary. The price he paid for this role was everything he had once held dear, but the service he now provides may prove essential for the survival of everything that continues to exist. The great sword that once gleamed with divine blessing now pulses with dark energy in the depths where light itself becomes negotiable. The armor that once reflected the glory of Anor Londo now bears the marks of transformation that transcend simple categories of corruption or purification. The knight who once served gods with unwavering faith now guards mysteries that those same gods preferred to keep hidden. Yet, in some fundamental sense, Artorias remains who he always was, a protector of those who cannot protect themselves, a guardian of what is precious and vulnerable, a being whose essential nature transcends any particular form or allegiance. The transformation that claimed him changed the methods available to him, but did not alter the basic orientation that made him a hero in the first place. This continuity across radical change offers hope that meaning and purpose can survive even the most devastating transformations. Artorias' story suggests that the deepest aspects of character and identity might be more resilient than we typically assume, capable of finding new expressions even when their original contexts have been completely destroyed. The bond between knight and wolf that persists across the barriers between light and dark, life and death, transformation and continuity, serves as the most powerful symbol of this resilience. Sif's continued vigil at his master's grave demonstrates that love can endure any change, can find ways to express itself, regardless of circumstances, can serve as an anchor that prevents even the most radical transformation from becoming complete dissolution. In the end, The story of Artorias the Abysswalker is a meditation on the nature of heroism itself, on the costs and benefits of dedication to causes that exceed individual understanding, on the possibility of meaning in a universe that seems designed to test every form of certainty. His legend will continue to evolve as new generations encounter it, each adding their own interpretations and insights to a narrative that has already transcended the boundaries of individual biography to become mythology. The knight who walked into darkness so that others might remain in light continues his vigil in realms where the distinction between those categories becomes meaningless. His sacrifice was real and meaningful, but it was not final. The story continues, as it must, with each new hero who faces similar choices and each new generation that must decide what lessons to draw from the examples left by those who came before. And so we leave Artorias where we found him, not in the golden halls of Anar Lundo where his legend began, but in the depths of the abyss where his true work continues. The knight who sought to protect others through strength and righteousness learned that the deepest forms of protection sometimes require sacrifices that transform the protector beyond recognition. His story reminds us that heroism is not about achieving perfect victories, but about maintaining purpose and meaning, even when the costs of doing so exceed anything we thought we were prepared to pay. The darkness that claimed him was not his enemy, but his inheritance. Not corruption, but revelation. Not defeat, but transformation into something that serves purposes larger than any individual life could normally encompass. In accepting that transformation, Artorias achieved a form of victory that transcends the simple categories of success and failure, demonstrating that the greatest heroes are not those who avoid tragedy, but those who find ways to transform tragedy into service. His vigil continues, as it always will, in the spaces between light and dark, where the most important work is done by those who are willing to serve purposes they may never fully understand. The legend lives on, inspiring new heroes, while warning them of costs they may someday be called upon to pay. And in the preservation of that legend, in the retelling of that story, in the ongoing interpretation of its meaning for each new generation that encounters it, something of the knight's original purpose finds new expression. The Abysswalker walks still, in the darkness that exists within every choice between safety and service, in the depths that open beneath every decision to place others' welfare above one's own comfort, in the shadows that gather around anyone who dares to love something more than their own continued existence. His story is our story, his choices are our choices, and his legacy is whatever we choose to make of the example he has left for us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of gaming's most profound and tragic tales. The story of Artorias reminds us that true heroism is not about avoiding darkness, but about finding ways to serve light, even after we have been touched by shadow. If you enjoyed this exploration of Dark Souls' deepest lore, please like and subscribe for more videos diving into the stories that give meaning to our favorite games. Until next time, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers, and remember, sometimes the greatest knights are those who walk in darkness so that others may remain in light.